Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we're back. I'm Axel Threlfall with Reuters. This is part two of the high-level opening of the inaugural regional session of UNEP's Science Policy Business Forum for Asia and the Pacific region. In the last segment, we examined the context and strategies to ease the transition from pandemic to recovery, looking primarily at government policies, intergovernmental action, technology transfer, and equity. In this segment, which is entitled Technology, Innovation, People, we turn our attention to private sector leadership and the interdependencies and integration required to develop nature-positive and people-centered approaches to recovery and to sustainable growth. Another super lineup of speakers who I'll introduce in just a moment, though. We start our session with a message from His Excellency Sveinung Rotevatn. He is President of the UN Environment Assembly and Minister of Environment and Climate in Norway.
Excellencies, colleagues, friends, it gives me great pleasure to address you today at the opening of the first Asia-Pacific UN Science Policy Business Forum on the environment. I'm pleased to see this global platform launch its first regional event in the Asia-Pacific, a region that bears much of the peril of climate change and at the same time carries much of the promise for transformative action. The Science Policy Business Forum, since its inception just over 3 years ago, has brought together a wide range of stakeholders. Technology, innovation, partnerships, and integrated solutions for nature form the key points of interaction towards the achievement of the environmental dimension of the Sustainable Development Goals. The diverse economies of Asia and the Pacific region are starting to bounce back after the shocks caused by the COVID-19 pandemic and the impact of climate change-induced natural disasters. But the recovery has been uneven, with only a handful of countries surpassing pre-COVID growth levels. Small island economies continue to suffer severe economic contraction, and poverty in the region is at its highest in 20 years. The Science Policy Business Forum will examine pathways for a sustainable, equitable, and inclusive rebound from COVID-19 that is good for the people, the planet, and our economies. This cannot come at a timelier moment. This forum has a specifically dynamic approach, willing to innovate and question established ways of approaching dialogue and progress. And this is indeed a moment for creating true meeting places where private companies that work hard to be first with the solutions, to do a little better than last month, can meet the scientists that share the latest knowledge and prospects for where change is headed. This is also a place where governments get stimulated in our search for strategies for more jobs and a full, green and inclusive recovery. Governments also need to develop positions in multilateral processes on all of this, like the upcoming Glasgow COP26 on climate change, the high-level meeting and COP15 of the Convention on Biodiversity, and the 5th UN Environmental Assembly in between it all, with its holistic focus on actions for nature to reach the Sustainable Development Goals. Meetings such as this forum help us realize what is indeed possible. We have recently heard the Secretary General say that it is now code red for humanity. We have, for some time, been aware of where it is headed with business as usual. However, I sincerely do not think that business as usual describes very well what is going on in the world. I am inspired to see countries in all regions, and especially this region, already taking transformative action. Science is stepping up, for example, with a new cooperation between the International Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, and IPBES, the International Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Most of the business sector is realizing they must be part of the answer to the urgent call for sustainable change. I also believe that partnerships that assist least developed countries are both growing and becoming more effective. I would like to seize this opportunity to congratulate the government of the Republic of Korea for the pioneering Carbon Neutrality Act passed by the National Assembly last month, heralding a new economic and social transition towards 2050 carbon neutrality. With this, Korea becomes the 14th country in the world to legislate carbon neutrality by 2050, joining the ranks of New Zealand and Japan at the regional level. It also stipulated a 35% or more reduction by 2030 from 2018 levels. Soon, I hope, we will see the whole region make significant progress in this area. Already, China made significant pledges in this direction, while Nepal, Singapore, Bhutan, and others submitted their plans to the UN. The forum also shines light on the issue of marine plastic pollution. During its thematic sessions this afternoon, it will examine the impacts of marine litter and plastic pollution on the environment in the Asia-Pacific region, focusing on the voluntary and policy actions and solutions that governments, investors, and industry need to take to overcome the current crisis. Countries in Asia and the Pacific are heavily affected by the consequences of marine litter and plastic pollution. The scale and the scope of commitments by governments, industry, and investors need to be significantly augmented to better mitigate and manage current challenges. Many are calling for UNEA 5 to take a decision to establish an intergovernmental negotiating committee for a new global agreement, providing a long-term framework for action. Transforming social and economic systems means improving our relationship with nature, understanding its value, and putting that value at the heart of our decision-making.
All right, many thanks to the Minister from Norway for those opening words. Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce our distinguished panel now. Sonia Layton-Cohn, Director of Corporate Affairs, UN Environment Programme. Tapan Mishra, UN Resident Coordinator in Mongolia. Harry Fahar, Vice President, Head of Global Public and Government Affairs, Signify. Stephen Kukoda, Executive Director of the International Copper Association. Diane Holdorf, Managing Director, World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Jana Gevrokian, Director of the Secretariat of the Group on Earth Observation, and Professor Dr. Graham Durant, Director, Australian National Science and Technology Centre, VP Asia Pacific Network of Sciences Centres, and a member of the Order of Australia. A very warm welcome to all of you. And I do look forward to this session. I've spoken to a number of you before, and it is always compelling stuff. Sonia Layton-Cohn, let me start with you if I could. This aspiration, this necessity of making peace with nature, not only as part of the recovery post-COVID, but to avoid future pandemics is critical. UNEP, and we heard in the first part of the high-level talks this morning, UNEP clearly identifies the root causes behind the pandemic as the same ones driving the three planetary crises: the climate crisis, biodiversity in nature, and the pollution and waste crisis. How do we not only deal with the aftermath of the pandemic, Sonia, but how do we avoid future pandemics with all the health and the socioeconomic implications that go with it?
Thank you, Axel. Indeed, we are living in a world where this new normal, a way of life dictated by the pandemic that was inconceivable just a year ago, is impacting every aspect of our lives, which have so dramatically changed, perhaps irretrievably. And so we ask ourselves exactly, is the pandemic a warning we're pushing nature too hard? Our world continues to heat at an accelerating rate, as the new IPCC report clearly demonstrates. Pollution of the air, land, and sea is still claiming lives and damaging crucial ecosystems. It best tells us 1 million species face the threat of extinction. Land is facing the onslaught of degradation, impacting 3.2 billion people. And a recent study in Nature showed that the Atlantic Ocean is teeming with plastic, up to 12 million tons in just the top 200 meters. So this clearly tells us integrated global challenges need integrated global solutions. The scale of transformation needs to tackle the three planetary crises: the climate crisis, the pollution crisis, the nature and biodiversity crisis. This is only possible when everyone is on board and playing their part. At the dawn of the decade of ecosystem restoration, we must all do our part to reset the system. Everyone attending this event must help us. It requires a long term transformation of how humanity extracts and consumes resources. It requires a rapid and permanent shift to a world that works with nature and not against it.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Sonia. Let me follow up uh, with a question, the most relevant question, I think, to this part of the session. What is UNEP's message to the private sector as we strive to steer the ship in the right direction ahead of the Biodiversity Summit, ahead of COP26 in Glasgow? What is UNEP's main message, overarching message to the private sector?
Well, let me first say that we have to all look at science, which is, telling us very clearly that human influence has warmed the climate at a rate that is unprecedented in the last 2,000 years. And as you just heard the previous speaker say, it is a code red for humanity, as our Secretary General puts it. But a catastrophe can be avoided if the world acts fast. And as we saw and we just heard about, there is also some pioneering net zero initiatives in Asia Pacific. For example, the Republic of Korea's National Assembly just passed the new Carbon Neutrality Act, heralding a new economic and social transition towards 2050 carbon neutrality. And with this, Korea becomes the 14th country in the world to legislate carbon neutrality, joining the ranks of New Zealand and Japan. And already, China has made significant pledges in this direction, with Nepal, Singapore, and Bhutan also doing their part and putting plans forward. So, transforming social and economic systems means improving our relationship with nature, understanding its value, and putting the value at the heart. So, for the private sector, I'd like to say particularly that the UN envisages that by 2030, the SDGs will be the main global guidance framework for businesses, investors, and governments, unlocking 1 trillion in private capital and increasing the number of businesses of all sizes that align their strategies and operations within the SDGs. But to capitalize on that, we need to create the policy environment that reduces risk and fosters an inclusive and green economy, leading at the end to what we believe will be the environmental sustainability and eradication of poverty. UNEP is dedicated to building meaningful cross sectoral partnerships that advocate business accountability and action for the environment. We also advocate for policies that encourage and foster such actions. And this is why this forum and our work together is timely. The forum, thanks to its partnerships and pilots, provides a catalyst that unifies diverse voices and advocates solutions towards a green economy and post pandemic recovery. Ones that are
Mhm.
driven by clean investment, advances in science and technology, empowering policies, and innovative financing. So today there is no doubt at all that human activities are at the root of our descent into chaos, which means that also human action will help solve it. UNEP Science Policy Business Forum advocates for partnership for transformation. The commitment of the forum, with its great partnerships leading the way, show us what we can do together.
Okay, Sonia, thank you so much for those words. Tapan Mishra is UN Resident Coordinator in Mongolia. Tapan, thank you very much for joining us. As UN Resident Coordinator, you're at the heart of reform, a UN reform. So from that perspective, what is the role of the private sector? What role are they expected to play in an equitable, nature positive recovery from COVID-19, especially in the context of least developed countries?
Thank you, Axel. First, let me thank the UNEP colleagues for inviting me to speak at this high level opening session and share my views as the UN resident coordinator in Mongolia, especially about the implementation of UN reform in that country and the UN's collective contribution towards a healthy rebound for the Mongolian people, nature, and economy. As you all know, in June 2018, the General Assembly adopted the most far reaching development reforms in the history of the United Nations. At the core of the resolution 72 to 79 was the establishment of a reinvigorated, independent, impartial, and empowered resident coordinator system that would facilitate the emergence of a new generation UN country team, leveraging the capacity of all stakeholders, including the private sector. This reform has been initiated by the UN Secretary General in response to the unified call by member states for deeply transformed UN development system with impact, coherence, and accountability at the center. As the world leaders adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, it became clear that the UN's primary vehicle for supporting countries with its implementation was not fit for purpose. Therefore, through the decades, the UN development system has made tremendous contribution to improving human well-being, but a fragmented network of some 36 entities was not prepared to deliver the transformative support that countries were demanding to advance the sustainable development goals. In Mongolia, as an example, the rollout of the new invigorated RC system started in 2019, where it took us almost about 2 years before we could get fully staffed with the 5 professional positions. And from day one, my office has been start engaging with a wide set of UN entities in the UN country team, both resident in the country and non-resident, including UNEP, as well as specialized agencies, UNSCAP, the DESA, Department of Economic Social Affairs, and all others stakeholders. We have facilitated more and coherent UN engagement with the government of Mongolia and wide range of partners on the ground, including the international financial institutions, the IFIs, and the private sector, the civil society, the academia, and all other contributors to the development of Mongolia. The COVID 19 pandemic was the first major test for the UNRC system and the UN country team, and we could show the considerable value and potential in rapidly facilitating a coherent and effective response to the immediate health, humanitarian, and socioeconomic impact of the COVID 19 pandemic. In the UN in Mongolia, leveraged and repurposed about $20 million to ensure provision of essential health related services, distant learning support for children, vaccination of children against life threatening diseases, child money top ups for families to overcome the financial challenges, the gender based violence services for women and girls despite the COVID 19 restraints and lockdowns and constraints that we had. We also have been significantly strengthening our collaboration and coordination with the government institutions, IFIs, development partners by establishing with the Deputy Prime Minister an integrated coordination group, creating a comprehensive web-based platform to monitor real-time the COVID situation and its impact on people and businesses. The COVID response has set the bar, providing a blueprint to how we can leverage the diverse and immense capacities of the UN system and engaging the wider set of development partners and especially the private sector to accelerate SDG implementation during the decade of action that we have ahead of us. The most recent example is that the high level National SDG Forum that we held yesterday with the participation of the Speaker of the Parliament, the Prime Minister, and the Assistant Secretary General of DESA and Chief Economist, and all other stakeholders. We discussed, including the private sector, which was very active and had a very focused discussion on engaging the private sector on SDG implementation. We discussed the way forward, acknowledging the need for more and strengthened coordination with the parliamentarians, with the government institutions, with private sector, academia, civil society, and development partners. The Parliament launched a multi stakeholder council for sustainable development. This platform will enable a more integrated policy advice and joint programmatic support from the UN development system and also all development partners on key SDG transitions. It'll help also in the system to engage in ambitious partnerships and help leveraging finances from all sources, and especially the private sector's engagement and with Mongolia's sustainable development priorities in line with the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. Now, this is a pivotal moment for all of us to work together, and we are able to keep our promise to Mongolia on a sustainable, resilient, and inclusive path. In this climate change, the code red that you talked about and the Secretary General has talked about, in this effort, we'll be working with the UN Global Compact to provide the private sector in Mongolia more opportunities to engage in SDG implementation because we have been pushed back by the pandemic and we need to accelerate towards the sustainable development goals. Finally, we also see improved coordination of our common country analysis, which is data driven and identifies the country's needs and challenges in the SDG implementation. The common country analysis will translate into the first sustainable development cooperation framework of the United Nations that will hopefully lead to integrated planning and shift in the nature of quality of supporting the UN country teams here. I would like to note the work conducted by the regional issue-based coalitions that reinforces the capacities of the UN country teams to address specific development challenges and ensure alignment with the UN's normative agenda on human rights, gender equality, and leaving no one behind. The development coordination system has leveraged wider reforms and partnerships with the government and development partners, and especially the private sector. For example, the advancement of climate action in Mongolia, the development of national plans on the NDC's implementation. I would like to particularly emphasize that they've been working with the partnerships and actions on green economy, the PAGE program on energy subsidies and reform, including sustainable tourism. We are closely working with the government and development partners, rolling out the UN digitalization strategy, the youth strategy, the SG's action to human rights, and to achieve sustainable development together. Recently, in a multi stakeholder event, the President of Mongolia, along with the Speaker and the Prime Minister, led a joint session on private sector engagement on public private partnerships, along with participation of the UN and all IFIs and other stakeholders for recovery and sustainable economic development. The convening role of the United Nations, even at the country level, has been emphasized by the Secretary General and TSG. We are moving towards effective implementation of the SDGs from policy coherence
Yep.
and planning to budgeting and financing, implementing, monitoring, and reporting, the active engagements of all stakeholders. In Mongolia, finally, I want to say that the Mongolian
Okay.
National
Yep.
Chamber of Commerce and the Employers Federation are closely working with us, and we look forward to working with them closely and even signing MOUs. Certainly, we are working close partners, including the private sector in Mongolia, in the UN reform. So, thank you, Axel. I may have taken a little more than to give you some concrete examples. Over to you.
Very good. Thank you, Tapan. And thank you to Sonia again as well, for both of you for setting the scene so well there. I want to move on to the subtitle, the sub-theme of restarting economies and accelerating the net zero transition. Three speakers are going to join for this section. Harry Ferhar, Stephen Kukoda, and Diane Holder. Welcome to all of you. Harry, let me kick it off with you, and then I'll do you each separately, and then we can throw a few of these issues around. You've been for well over 20 years an architect of global energy strategy, responding to climate change issues, resource efficiency, etc., etc. Big question to you, Harry, to start. How do we transition to net zero when entire economies in the developing and the developed world are still so dependent on fossil fuels? And look, you saw that in the UK just recently. Petrol stations running out of petrol because the petrol couldn't be delivered there. People queuing up for miles and miles and miles to buy their petrol. Again, a reminder of just how dependent we are on fossil fuels.
Indeed, so the energy that you don't need to stand in line for, and also the sun and the wind will never run short in supply. But in fact, to move faster to net zero carbon, we need two companion strands of strategy. You could say for developed countries, or actually where infrastructure is already future infrastructure is already in place, or most of it. we need to, let's say, put priority on renovation of infrastructure. And there the magic formula is 3%. Also together with Steve Kokoda, with some of your colleagues at UNEP, with the International Energy Agency, we are a member of the 3% club. And we just need to a little bit more than double existing current renovation rates to 3% per year, and combine that also with an increase of uptake of 3% in energy efficiency per year. And that brings us, for a large part, close to zero carbon. We will need some carbon engineering, but I think that's on top of the menu in developed countries. And for developing countries, it is important to leapfrog, to skip some of the older conventional technologies and to move to the clean technology. And in our case, that means, for instance, connected lighting, connected street lighting. So many cities are growing, and certainly so in developing countries, and about half of their energy bill is in lighting. And if you now see what Jakarta has done, Jakarta has leapfrogged to what we call connected LED street lighting, 90,000 pieces, so more than halving, let's say, I think even reducing by 70% their energy bill for street lighting, and at the same time, through this intelligent solution, implementing something that can become the backbone of the IoT of a smart city. So, and it's also important that we see how to leapfrog in developing countries, so that also the development gap doesn't further widen. This would also stir further climate change, migration, even populism. So it's both of these combined.
And you think you feel the employment of energy efficient lighting can be done at scale in developing and least developed economies? How optimistic are you that we can see this really scaled up to the point where it needs to be?
Well, actually, yeah, it's the only way to go. So for any technology, and in our case for lighting, to go to the most efficient solutions. It is already quite some time back, at the end of 2007, that we called for the global phase out of incandescent light bulbs, which was actually at that time 2/3 of our sales volume. But also at that time, lighting was 19% of global electricity. And last year it was down to 12 to 13%. And by a further transition to LED lighting, this will be down to 8% in 2030. And then at the same time, the use of light, because of population growth and urbanization, will have grown by more than a third. And you could say also there, the cheapest lamp is the most expensive. So where a lot of socioeconomic development started, and once people got access to artificial lighting, and then it's really the clean technologies that bring, let's say, that combine decarbonization with benefits of those more modern solutions, and at the same time also creating jobs in the process.
Are you hopeful
and
for
maybe
COP,
one
Harry? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, give me an example.
Yeah, no, indeed. So one example there is that, for instance, in again coming back to leapfrogging, in Uttar Pradesh in India, we implemented a project with 80,000 solar LED streetlights for a few thousand communities, and then actually had then straight away you go to zero carbon solutions. So it is possible. If I'm optimistic for COP, I sometimes call myself a concerned optimist. I'm an optimist because we're moving in the right direction. So energy efficiency, renewable energy, some what I call carbon engineering, nature-based solutions is unstoppable. But I'm concerned because, even while we have been talking and also working hard for years, we still see that we need to double the speed at which we're traveling towards this net zero carbon world. So for COP, I hope
stay with
that
us,
indeed.
Harry. Yeah. Sorry, I keep interrupting. Go ahead.
No, that's fine because I left a short break. No, but I think for COP that we should really focus on the how question, and not so much. Of course, some countries also need to further embrace finally that net zero carbon goal, but let's really explore the how question, and that is also for part in the mission of the forum. So to look at what enabling policies, what awareness on existing technologies, what business models that can actually do the job, because it's not so much that people don't want to move. But and we see more and more that we are in the same room with people who are searching for the tools. So how actually to get there.
Very good, Harry. Thanks a lot. Do stay with us, as I just said. Before we move on to Stephen, just a reminder to all of our viewers out there, send your questions through to the platform. I'll do my best to get as many of those questions to our panelists as I can. Stephen Kokoda, you represent the copper industry globally. Talk to us a little bit about the challenges facing developing countries in restarting their economies post-COVID, especially in terms of climate and energy efficiency?
So the International Copper Association.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay. Can we hear me now?
Yep.
Excellent, great. Thanks, Axel. It's great to be here. And the International Copper Association is proud to be one of the founding members of the UN Science Policy Business Forum. You know, we saw this as really a great void in connecting all three of these sectors together, and it's gratifying to see the launch of the forum in the Asia Pacific. And yeah, so just a brief word about ICA. Our members represent a majority of global copper production and are the responsible stewards of the world's copper industry. And the investments by our members go towards partnerships and projects that are making positive impacts on numerous UN SDGs. And we're particularly strong in SDG 7. And of course, copper is critically important in this region. Asia Pacific region uses more than 70% of copper demand annually. Of course, the region has suffered the negative impacts of the pandemic, and the challenges associated with restarting local economies are enormous. However, I believe that with every challenge comes an opportunity, and I see an opportunity to double down on climate action while economies are rebuilt. And to pick up on the theme that Harry spoke about a few moments ago, I want to focus on energy efficiency. And we can't speak about climate action without speaking about the importance of energy efficiency. And according to the IEA, energy efficiency has the greatest share of action needed if we are to achieve the Paris Agreement. And why is that? Well, by using less energy, of course, we reduce CO2 emissions, but we also make businesses more competitive. We make people wealthier as they have more disposable income, and then we make grids more resilient as their loads are lightened. But how do we get there? Well, governments need to put in place or increase their efficiency standards. We're talking about MEPS, or minimum energy performance standards, for all of the products that are consuming electricity in the region. So this means air conditioners, refrigerators, and appliances in homes. It means motors, machinery, cooling and heating, and other systems in businesses. It means things like power and distribution transformers in their transmission and distribution systems. And importantly, it means adopting building codes that ensure the massive trends towards urbanization is sustainable. And the good news is that there are existing initiatives to support the region in their transition towards energy efficient economies. Harry mentioned the 3% Club that brings together all of the organizations that bring the expertise and the experience in energy efficiency. My organization, along with UNEP and more than 24 project partners, leads something called United for Efficiency, or U4E, and that's transforming developing world economies towards energy efficient appliances, industrial equipment, and lighting. U4E is already making an impact in the region. And I want to touch on one point, Axel, and that's the regional harmonization of standards. So U4E helped 10 countries in the ASEAN to harmonize on a standard for room air conditioners, and now that sub-region is looking at other sectors. I encourage the forum to bring together countries to work together to harmonize on their efficiency standards, and that will importantly bring down the costs of high-efficiency products as we achieve economies of scale. It also leads to the sharing of costs for things like monitoring, verification, and enforcement of standards, as these critical functions can be shared. For example, why have a testing facility to verify efficiency standards for motors in every country in a region when one country can serve as a testing hub for several countries? Now, obvious candidates are home appliances, as I had said. Motors is a sector that drives about half of the world's electricity consumption. And in this region, some of the highly industrialized nations, that's as high as 70%. Now, there's a lack of awareness about energy efficiency globally, which frustrates me. But I want to touch finally on just one of the other important barriers, and that's a lack of financing. Now, I mentioned the IEA already, and each year the IEA publishes a global status report on energy efficiency. And invariably, that report each year states that we need to triple investments in energy efficiency if global climate targets to be met. Now, at a clean energy finance event, a speaker from the World Bank stated that we actually need to increase investments in energy efficiency by a factor of 9. And that speaker went on to say that of that inefficient pot of money going towards this important sector, less than 1% of it goes towards legwork on the ground in countries that ultimately leads to the big bankable projects that everyone wants to see. So someone has to finance that 1%. So I call the finance community, that's the development banks and private finance alike, to ramp up their investments in energy efficiency on projects here in Asia Pacific and around the world. I already mentioned there's no shortage of organizations working in this space. and there's no shortage of projects. What there is in short supply are bankable projects. And just because a project isn't being developed in a way that lends itself to financing doesn't mean a project isn't worthwhile. So I see a role for this forum to connect the regional financial institutions with the solutions providers so they can together roll up their sleeves and define and refine priority sectors and projects for financing. If we're serious about climate action, the answer to questions on energy efficiency from the finance community can no longer be no. The answer can be not that way, but let's work together to refine your project so we could change the answer to yes. So that's my call of action to the finance community. No more no's to energy efficiency finance. The work needs to be done if we're serious on climate action. Let's get it done. And my final call to action to this forum is to commit to energy efficiency standards and to work together with partnerships and organizations that could support you, like mine. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Stephen. Look, I've got a couple of questions on the back of this, actually, very quickly. First, on the harmonization of standards, the regulatory frameworks. Are the policy frameworks in place generally across the region that give you reason for optimism when it comes to the harmonization of standards and level playing fields?
Yeah, it's the right question to ask, Axel. In the developed part of the region, the MEPs are in place. The MEPs can always be increased, so we encourage countries that do have standards in place to consider them to be on a ladder, right? Set that baseline, but then as technologies improve, then let your efficiency standards improve along the line. The real challenge, though, Axel, is in the developing world countries. And in this region and around the world, they are woefully absent or they're behind best available technology. Financing is a big part of that. Let's face it, efficient products, even though costs continue to come down, they still cost more than less efficient products. So if you're going into a developing world country and saying, let's increase your standards, you're immediately increasing the costs on people and businesses. Total cost of ownership will take care of that. The lifetime cost of the products is there, and you will save money over time. But that upfront cost barrier is really one of the biggest detriments to the developing world countries. And again, that's where the finance community come in, finance that first.
And a very quick call on the finance bit, and I'll come to Diane in a second. You talk about the need. You make this call out to the private sector and to the financiers and to the development banks. Are you seeing anything that gives you hope right now in the region that we're talking about today?
Yeah, I mean, the finance community is adapting, right? My call to action doesn't change because obviously more needs to be done. But I am optimistic. In COP26 in particular, we're going to see a number of events convened just around the finance question. I'll call one organization out, Sustainable Energy for All. I think they're really the linchpins on SDG 7. And they will be convening an event on finance at the SDG 7 Pavilion at COP26, and I look forward to participating there. And the Sustainable Innovation Forum as well will have sessions dedicated to finance. So, we're seeing improvements there. I could go on and on, Axel. I won't. The issue really is just that those initial investments that aren't the most profitable bits. That capacity building on the ground, the technical assistance that countries need to help them to have the resources to put in place and to enforce the standards. That's really where the gap is.
All right, Stephen, as always, many thanks. And stay with us. I want to bring you back in. Diane, with that in mind, with what we've just heard Stephen say, and indeed Harry, how does the World Business Council for Sustainable Development act on what's on offer? How do you help countries design and implement solutions that are good for the people, good for the economies?
Hey, Axel, thanks so much. WBCSD, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, is working with more than 200 leading global companies on creating the types of business-led innovation and solutions that integrate how business plays a critical role, working together in partnership with governments and other stakeholders to ensure that 9+ billion people can live well within planetary boundaries by 2050. These are issues that have really been brought into stark focus with the COVID crisis, of course, which we know the region is still working through together with the rest of the world. It's interesting because as we reflect back on the start of the COVID crisis, in the beginning, it was really very tightly linked to this critical issue of nature loss. And as the many countries and in fact business communities have moved through what has now become an economic crisis and a health crisis, we've lost a little bit of that initial connectivity to why we have to operate within these boundaries of biodiversity preservation and in fact climate as well. Another thing that the COVID crisis has really shown a very bright light on is inequity. Now, these are all issues that continue to be brought forward that need to be addressed by the governments as well as by the businesses. We've talked a lot here about energy sector and the energy needs. We work, of course, very closely across the energy sector, transportation and mobility, the built environment, et cetera. I work very closely as well with food and agriculture. And while we know that energy has a huge role to play in solving for these issues of the climate emergency, we know that food production and land use has a huge contribution as well. You know, Stephen started talking about where we're going to be having these big conversations, and COP26 is a big milestone event coming up on the horizon here. It's bringing a tremendous amount of focus to what we need to do together to respond to the integrated issues of climate and nature. And business is, in fact, doing quite a lot in this space. We're really starting to see big transformations around how to operate global business at a net zero, nature positive way that also is striving for these equitable issues. Now, these are urgent because not just is it a risk issue for businesses. We're seeing value chains impacted through COVID. We're seeing weather impacts on valuation and performance and access driven by climate. We're seeing real challenge to growing cycles, et cetera, impacted related to land use change. So these do create business risk, but equally, there's tremendous business opportunity in here as well. And this is where we're starting to see innovation and technology and different types of financing for the transitions that we need coming through leading business sectors and the finance community. The other area that we're seeing start to gain a tremendous amount of momentum is how business performance is valued in the face of their performance against these risks and opportunities. So valuation has traditionally looked at standard stock price, still very much at the heart of valuation components. But equally, we're starting to see investors ask our members and other companies along these value chain sectors a lot more questions about their climate readiness, what they're doing about deforestation, how they're acting on human rights and inequality, because they recognize as investors and shareholders that these challenges create not just reputational risks, but also very real financial risks. And that the companies who are most well positioned in understanding how these climate, nature, and in fact now equity risks impact their performance and value chains are those that often are the most resilient in the face not just of crises like what we've experienced with COVID, but an overall standard business performance as well. So we're seeing the response from the financial community start to embed itself into governance and reporting standards. We, of course, have a now much stronger understanding of the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, the TCFD. We're starting to see strong development of the Task Force of Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, the TNFD. And these are all areas where WBCSD is engaging as an interface between how these standards start to come together for reporting on environment and social risks and how those get integrated into business performance and strategic operationalization, but also on business readiness to be able to do that kind of reporting. But there's a lot of other types of partnerships and other ways that the finance community isn't getting engaged. And when we think about what that means for the region, you know, again, I want to go back, Stephen and Harry have really spoken to the energy sector, but when we look at food and land use, this is also a huge area of opportunity in the region. Rice is a huge example of this. And I'll come back with an example if you have time on where we're seeing some major investment, over 70 million, into how we address these types of issues.
Okay, good. Look, I do want to, I've got a little a wary eye on the time, but I do want to talk about public procurement for a moment, and the enormous purchasing power that it wields. And the role, of course, that it plays, the key role in achieving sustainable consumption and production, addressing the pillars of sustainable development. Stephen, I'd like to hear from all of you on this point. Stephen, let me start with you. What do we need to see? What steps need to be taken to leverage that purchasing power globally, would you say?
Sure. I'm glad, excuse me, Axel, I'm glad you brought that up. And I'm going to read something, a quote from a report, because I want to get it correctly. So we talk about government procurement, but I think we also need to talk about institutional procurement. And when you combine those two, they form the largest professionally managed economic demands driving the global economy and its associated greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, if you think about the massive purchasing power of governments and of large institutions, businesses, banks, retail, what have you. And you can imagine that, quite often, unfortunately, the primary driving decision for those purchases is that first cost. It's saving a few pennies here and there, which adds up to, to many, many dollars when you talk about the massive amounts of goods that are being purchased here. But that model really needs to change beyond the first cost. It goes back to some of my earlier comments on energy efficiency. You have to look at total cost of ownership, of course, but you also have to put sustainability into the equation. How is this decision to purchase, printers for the many offices in a government going to impact the country's greenhouse gas emissions, right? The couple of encouraging points along these lines is that we are seeing some governments, make that shift. I have some examples. In the interest of time, I won't go into all of them. If we come back, maybe I will. So that's encouraging in that regard. I'll pause right there, Axel, and give my colleagues an opportunity to weigh in on this. Thank you.
All right, Stephen. Thank you, Diane. What do you think we need to do to leverage this purchasing power, for the good of the economies, for the good of the planet? How much more work needs to be done to get this right?
Change, Axel, in corporate procurement, that drives a huge amount of the global value chain. So we can't underestimate the role of introducing the types of standards that require, for example, sustainably grown ingredients, sustainably sourced materials into corporate value chains. This work needs to be aligned so that those who are on the producing end can be much more consistent in what's being expected of them. But we're starting to see those types of methodologies grow and become more credible. Where we're seeing other really interesting opportunities is at the global trade level. We're starting to see requirements, for example, around human rights in assuring that violation-free supply chains are a legally reported requirement. This is now starting to move into deforestation-free supply chains and other types of sustainable production that will have great benefit for both climate and nature and are driving very big changes in how production occurs, as well as how trade is settled. And so these types of changes are where governments are having some of the biggest impacts, building it into their own procurement requirements, so that, for example, sustainable palm oil is required at a national level for purchasing beyond some of the European requirements into big consumption nations in Asia, is an example of where we could see some real transformational change start to occur on a very specific commodity that is a huge contribution to helping end deforestation. So moving these things forward through procurement, through trade policy, through production requirements can have big benefit.
Yeah. Okay, Diane, thank you. Harry, is all of this happening quickly enough? Well, first, you agree with what Diane and Stephen were saying. Second, is this happening quickly enough? Clearly not.
No, clearly not. But I think also for that it's good to take one step back and to see, okay, what does procurement actually need to do? So within procurement, you need to take the lifetime benefits, which are huge. So with lighting, sometimes the costs are 80% lower over lifetime. Well, for any new technology, the upfront costs are higher. Then what the redesign of procurement into what I would call circular procurement should do, it should move us away from invoicing hardware to paying per use, so paying for the service. And what we're already used to, many of us, is that, you don't need to own a car. You just pay per use by leasing it. And we are doing the same thing with lighting. We call it lighting as a service, and there are other models possible for other technologies. So where people that are then not confronted with this high upfront cost, but can immediately tap into the benefits that are then, let's say, financed over lifetime through the service-based business model. So that is the solution. If we see that this is actually the simplicity, and then circular procurement and the technicalities of that are a bit more complicated, obviously. But then that if that's the aim, then I think we can move forward on this discussion that has been long there, and which is not moving fast enough.
Yeah. Okay, Harry. Look, before we move on to the next section, I want to finish up with a broad and possibly a sort of rather controversial question or controversial notion to each of you. The subtitle of this bit was "Restarting Economies, Accelerating the Net Zero Transition." I wonder what each of you, very briefly, each of you, and Diane, let me start with you first. To what extent are net zero targets, both on the government side and the corporate side, actually a distraction to getting things done?
Actually, I would say they're not a distraction at all. They're actually really necessary. There are a lot of countries, a lot of companies who have already set net zero targets. What that does is it drives innovation, frankly, because achieving net zero within your own operations is one thing. Figuring out how you achieve that across your value chain requires a very different level of engagement and transparency. That's the type of visibility that actually drives benefit back into business, because you've got a much deeper understanding of your sourcing and your impacts, while helping to achieve what needs to be accelerated, which is getting us to a net zero economy. So I think it's actually a critical time and a critical opportunity to be setting those targets, leading by example. We've got companies who can show others how to get it done, and then helping folks understand what are the types of changes that they actually need to do to be prepared to take the steps to decarbonize. We've got to do it now.
Yeah, okay. All right, fair enough. Stephen, same question to you. And I ask it because I wonder this focus, sort of 10, 20, 30 years down the road, the 2050s, does it mean some companies, some governments take their eye off the near-term ball?
Yeah, it's an important question that you're asking, Axel. And personally, when I look at some of the targets, I wonder the same thing. Look, it's not easy to get to net zero, obviously, otherwise it would be done by now, right? I do see that, yeah, punting it out that far sometimes is concerning, but at the same time, we are seeing progress. Near-term targets, need to be strengthened. The NDCs need to be strengthened, but it will happen. If I could for a moment just speak about my own industry. Copper is critical to climate change, to climate action, to the clean energy transition. All three pillars, energy efficiency, renewables, e-mobility, require lots of copper. But that doesn't mean that my industry doesn't have an obligation to decarbonize. And I think that there's an important role for trade associations in that regard. So we represent the copper industry. Our members are the larger producers. So there's a role for my organization in this, and we are helping our members to develop a global decarbonization roadmap, and we hope to make an announcement on that early next year.
Okay, Stephen, thank you. And finally, Harry, is it a cynical question, my question?
No, I think it's an important question, and actually two sides to it. I think when I mentioned this, you have this aha moment. There's indeed the whole threat part of it that we're talking about. So none of us can be successful on a planet that we ruin. But it's not for nothing that COP26 chose Race to the Future as a theme, because also they're moving to carbon neutrality is a huge innovation race. And also, it's huge innovation, but it's also a race. We see in our industry where we transitioned from conventional technology to now 84% LED lighting, a transition that was faster than that for laptop computers or smartphones, that this was also for us a race for survival, because some of the legacy companies with whom we competed in the past are no longer there, and new companies have emerged. So this is as much, let's say, a threat as well as an opportunity, because there are those new technologies, so there's innovation that is also creating the jobs of the future. So let's also look at the upside. Let's stay concerned, and let's keep on doing what we're doing. But there is definitely a huge upside. So moving towards carbon neutrality is not a punishment, but it will be a better world.
Okay. Thank you, Harry. And thank you to Stephen and Diane as well. Do stay with us if you can. No doubt there'll be some questions from the floor. And I want to just say once again, do send your questions through for our speakers because they are ready and willing to respond to them as soon as we're finished with this final section, which is on integrated action and community. Jana Gevorgyan is Director of Secretariat for the Group on Earth Observation. Jana, you're an advocate for interdisciplinary integrated action across communities, research and technologies. How can integration like this, just tell us to start with, how can this sort of integration help overcome the current crisis and help us come out stronger the other side?
Axel, and thanks to the colleagues at UNEP really for having me be part of this discussion. We heard previous speakers speak about integrated issues of climate and nature. At GEO, we call this year super policy year. 2021, we're seeing COP26 taking place, putting major emphasis on climate action, tying the ocean element into the discussions. This was also the year that launched the UN Ocean Decade, and the year when the Conference of the Parties on Conventional Biodiversity is taking place. These three global policy agendas on climate, biodiversity, and ocean really represent a massive nexus, which underscores the interconnectedness of the issues that they're trying to tackle. So this interconnectedness that deals with integrated issues also requires integrated solutions. And as solutions that ought to be data-driven, I don't think anyone at this time disputes that data plays a massive role in designing solutions across the value chain. The integrated approach to developing solutions requires us also to be integrating our research across communities and involving different communities, including policymaker communities and business communities, to join around these integrated nexus issues. When we speak of big data, I, representing the Group on Earth Observations, speak of big Earth data, so to speak. And it's so not surprising, and it's really fantastic that UNEP has called for big data strategy to be ready by 2025, which really looks at how to best harness big data, including big Earth data, with the latest digital technologies for the benefit of countries worldwide in order to enable sustainable solutions, sustainable policy, sustainable growth. It's really critical that we move away from the more old school sort of approach that we've seen quite a bit of working and sort of our individual disciplines, and be moving towards where the research communities are coming together to integrate tools, research outputs, in integrated solution methods, focusing on creating open knowledge. We have plethora of data sources these days. At the Group on Earth Observation, we're coordinating data from satellites, surface-based observations, citizen observations. We are benefiting from enormous momentum that's created in the business community that's really eager to be part of solutions worldwide and partnering with us to democratize access to this big data and extend access to digital technologies to countries worldwide, especially middle and low income countries. Our partnerships with Google, Amazon, and Microsoft are getting that big, massive data out to the users worldwide. But just data alone is not going to cut it. We absolutely need to develop knowledge that's open, knowledge that's reproducible, and knowledge that can be trustworthy. I think a key component here is actually this element of trust. Satellites collect observations, various sensors collect observations. If we want this data to be used in policy making in countries worldwide, we need to ensure that the users do have trust in how the various knowledge has been developed, so they're actually willing to put this knowledge into practice. So at Group on Earth Observations, we really emphasize our work with the private sector, our work with the research community, our work with the policy communities, but with a really single goal of getting open knowledge into the hands of the decision makers who need this knowledge now. And I will also say, go ahead.
Go ahead, Jana. Go ahead.
And a key element here that I'd like to emphasize, and this is especially important for ministers, we rely on them to be talking across sort of ministries. You know, in UNEP, we have ministries of environment very engaged. In GEO, we have different ministries that take the principal representation role, usually science technology, sometimes space agencies. What we really would like to see, and we're striving to achieve, is this cross-sectoral conversation at the ministerial level, so that the results of our science and technology work are actually informing policies made by ministries of agriculture, ministries of natural resources, ministries of environment. And that's why partnering with this forum is a really critical sort of link in this chain of getting the right information into the right decision makers' hands at the right time. And if I were to make a plea to ministries around the world, is to recognize that the quality of information that we are able to produce really relies on accessibility to data. So open data is vital element in this recipe of designing successful solutions. And it's, unfortunately, it's really not yet broadly implemented across the world. We have champion countries who have been implementing data policies for quite some time, but it's really important that this truly becomes the default in the public funded data collection.
Okay, let me ask
Over to you,
a quick
Axel.
follow-up question. This idea of open knowledge empowering and improving governance, where is it happening well now, would you say?
You know, I'd really like to perhaps focus on the Asia Pacific, because we are launching the SPBF's Asia Pacific Forum, and we're seeing quite a bit of this taking place within this region in particular. Maybe I'll mention one of the new budding initiatives that's taking place in the Pacific right now, where we're developing with the community of the Pacific Digital Earth Pacific that is going to really leverage the big Earth data and put it into an operational framework to drive engagement and development of solutions of the Pacific communities. And it's happening now from the beginning of co-designing this whole approach, this whole service, this whole infrastructure for data delivery from the start, involving the right steps of engaging the decision makers. So they're from the beginning involved in the design of this massive data infrastructure system, and are approaching this exactly from the perspective of being able to have transparency and how they're monitoring the various changes, in designing policies that are based on these open data, and therefore have confidence in the results that will come out of this knowledge creation.
Jana, thank you very much indeed for sharing all that with us. Jana Gevorkyan from GEO. Look, we've heard a lot about the need for the UN, government, civil society, and the private sector to build effective alliances to address some of the key challenges in this region and indeed elsewhere. The challenges, the global challenges we face, need concerted action, though, from all corners. Without full community involvement and massive scale changes in attitudes and behaviors of individuals, families, and communities, it really can't happen. Our final speaker in this panel, a session, has spent much of his life working to engage young people and communities in scientific endeavor. Professor Dr. Graham Durant, welcome to you. How do we engage people across the region that we're talking about today in support of science to address the challenges and the opportunities provided in this post-COVID recovery?
So we have to work very hard on this because it's not an easy topic. There are many people who have to change attitudes and behaviors. I think working in those fields, there are significant challenges in the region because of the diversity, geography, race, religion, politics, language, the isolation in some areas, and the social disadvantage, and of course the digital divide. So there's no one solution that will engage everybody. But I'm a great believer that citizen science has great potential in the region for gathering the data that is needed to measure and monitor the ongoing changes that are happening in our world. It provides one mechanism for turning concerned citizens into active participants in a process. And citizen science, as one mechanism, is at the moment underdeveloped in the Asia Pacific region, and yet it's got so much potential for policymakers, industry, scientists, environmental planners, land managers, and the public. And it addresses societal needs, and it can accelerate science and technological innovation through public participation in real world problems. So, active communities working alongside government, private sector, and civil society in alliances can help bridge the knowledge gap between aspiration and achievement. And in some countries, citizen science seems to be the only way to gather the data that's needed in support of the Sustainable Development Goals. But to develop citizen science, we need supportive government policies and authorization. And above all, we need nodes of excellence to share the excellent work that's already happening and build further capacity. I think we need, importantly, a decadal plan for the development of citizen science in the Asia Pacific region. So the world needs concerned citizens to become actively involved in the ongoing monitoring of changes in our planetary life support systems, contributing practical solutions on a local, national, and regional scale in partnership with the governments, philanthropists, and private sector investors. We need to use existing networks such as science centres, museums, botanic gardens that already connect with millions of citizens, as well as the existing intergovernmental bodies and NGOs at all levels. Universities, research networks, and academies need to be fully involved. So, in spite of all the diversity in the region, there are some common things that we share. For example, the ocean. We have a common ocean, and there are great challenges in the changes in that ocean that have to be monitored. And there's a significant opportunity to use citizen science to monitor some of those changes, whether they're species diversity, whether it's pollutants, whether it's coastal erosion. Another common challenge is in the health area, and mosquitoes are a vector for the spread of diseases such as malaria or Zika, and global warming is extending the range of mosquitoes. Citizen science and citizen scientists can be on the front line and an early warning system in the detection for invasive species that will affect human health. And the nature of these challenges, oceans, nature, health, illustrate where citizen science can play a role. Science needs a lot of data. It requires recording, identifying, measuring, sampling, analyzing, interpreting, evaluating, and dissemination of the results. And this is where citizen science can play a role alongside the established practices of science. There are many examples of citizen science projects underway in Australia and elsewhere around the region. And these projects have already developed innovative technologies to facilitate participation. They've found ways of making data, to solve problems of data entry, verification, training of citizens, and system interoperability. So how can we scale up such projects to make an impact across the region? So governments need to think about how they can use citizen science and how they can use the data, how we can build alliances of research organizations, civil society, business interests, philanthropy to address some of these common elements. We need a lot of data. we're going to need a lot of eyes and ears on the ground. We've got to need many different types of projects that have potential. But I think in the Asia Pacific region, we've got to find some simple exemplars that we can all get behind. We can measure the impact of them, and we can use those projects to encourage further interest and investment. So let's build citizen science up in the Asia Pacific region. Let's get people involved in helping as active participants to solve some of these great challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Graham. Can you hold up projects, citizen science projects, and the government support that comes as well on the back of that? Can you hold up projects elsewhere that might inspire those in the Asia Pacific region?
So at a government level, the Australian government supported the development of citizen science through grants and a prize for innovation in science communication. So developing exemplars of good practice, and also supporting the development of a citizen science association. So you're starting to build this community of practice. So you're building something at a government level, and then on the ground in the universities, the museums, and other organizations, there are many wonderful projects. For example, the Atlas of Living Australia already has over 100 million records in there. The great innovation coming from the museum sector, the Australian Museum has developed an app so that the public across Australia and wider afield can actually track frogs. They've developed an app to use, people can measure or record the sound of frogs and use those to identify species. And that citizen science approach this year has identified that there seems to be a pandemic amongst frogs in Australia. So about 1,300 data sets have come in from across the country suggesting that there is an issue with frog health. There are projects that can simply monitor coastal dynamics and erosion. A simple idea of putting a fixed cradle for a mobile phone so that visitors, walkers, locals can take pictures at a regular place of a local beach can be used through the development of a very innovative app that allows that data to be integrated to create long-term monitoring of the coastal dynamics and, importantly, the levels of erosion. There are apps for tracking invasive species in the oceans as parts of the ocean warms and species start to move around. And so there are many other examples. I mean, using citizens to ground truth satellite observations. The Australian national research body, CSIRO, uses citizen data to monitor the colour of water, which they can track from space, but they need to ground truth that information. So all of these projects, and I've cited on Australian examples for an obvious reason, but all of these projects around the region have developed innovation, technology, for public participation, and we need to find ways of scaling up these projects to get more and more people involved. And of course, bringing in the schools as well, because school citizen science offers so much potential on a long-term basis for monitoring local environment and also practical training by doing science.
Sure. And just very quickly to you and to Jana. In fact, let me start with Jana. This came through from the audience, and we have some interventions that I'll come to in a second. But this came through the audience. To that point, to the point Graham was just making. How can we best set up an APAC community of practice for citizen science to enable the sort of active involvement that is required? Jana, let's kick it off with you on that.
Very good question. Within GEO, we actually do have a citizen science community of practice. And we also do have an Asia-Oceania regional group on Earth observation. So I can see us working with the leads of this regional bloc, which are China, Japan, Korea, and Australia, of trying to bring citizen scientists into the bloc, at least as far as our efforts are concerned. Every year, AO-GEO, as we call it, Asia-Oceania GEO, holds very successful symposia, Asia-Oceania symposia, and I think it's actually probably a very good suggestion. I'm not sure when was the last time that citizen science track was a part of that symposia, but I think it's actually a very good idea of introducing it for the next one that's taking place in March, I believe. So I would actually be very happy to connect with Graham and see about, and with colleagues at AP SPBBF, to see about setting up a track for citizen
Very good.
science as part of the providing integrated solutions.
Super. I mean, that is exactly the sort of thing that we want to hear on the back of a meeting like this one, in terms of moving processes forward. Thank you. APAC Community of Practice for Citizen Science, Graham?
Yeah, absolutely needed so that we can work alongside the established networks in Europe and North America and the emerging networks in Africa and South America. We need global monitoring and we need people engaged right across the world. Mosquitoes don't respect political boundaries, and just the oceans are all common. So the challenges are global, and we need global mechanisms. So a strong network, a strong community of practice in the region, and we need to identify champions, lead organizations, ambassadors. We need to get some investment in establishing the mechanisms and getting the I suggest a decadal plan up and running as a means to really drive things forward.
Okay, very good, Graham. Thank you very much indeed, and Jana, to you too. Stay with us. I want to come to an intervention or two from our audience, and there are questions coming through for all of you. So do stay with us. I want to give the floor to Julio Anton, who is from the Youth Major Group. Julio, the floor is yours. Go ahead.
I speak before you with an urgent appeal. Listen to and work with the youth to address the current crisis, which brings before us both danger and opportunity. The recent IPCC report has highlighted the importance of achieving the 1.5-degree target. Engagements like this forum provide an opportunity for us to come together and craft innovative solutions to address the urgent problems of our time. The Asia-Pacific region, in particular its most vulnerable sectors, bear the brunt of the climate, COVID, and economic crises. A recent global survey on COVID resilience reveals that many countries in this region are doing poorly, with my country, the Philippines, ranking last. Youth unemployment has been dramatically exacerbated by the pandemic. The crisis has created a lockdown generation, disrupting the education of the youth and their prospects for finding work. The youth are also among the most vulnerable to the negative impacts of climate-related disasters. As in many countries, lockdowns and social distancing measures force many of us to use plastics. Without viable alternatives, regulating the use of disposable containers and other plastic products will remain an uphill battle, and these will end up in mismanaged dump sites or into the open ocean. Addressing these crises means re-examining our current systems. A crucial measure is to gradually phase out fossil fuel projects, as pointed out by recent IEA reports, if we are to achieve the 1.5-degree target. Following this effort to decarbonize our energy system, the same should be done throughout our supply chains. In order to address the plastic crises, we need to pivot towards more regenerative production and consumption patterns mindful of our carrying capacity. The business sector can be provided more incentives, especially by investing more on sustainability, including on climate finance. Expanding and regulating ESG protocols can go a long way in promoting sustainable financing. Governments should also support the waiver for intellectual property rights on vaccines and other health technologies necessary for addressing the pandemic. Sharing agreements should be drawn up to facilitate a faster and more equitable distribution of vaccines. We need comprehensive policies to address rising youth unemployment, including wage subsidies. Resilience studies and inclusive disaster risk reduction strategies should be strengthened in school curricula. Strong popular action is important now more than ever to complement policy interventions. In particular, the Children and Youth Major Group can be strengthened so that it becomes a more effective platform for the youth to actively engage and meaningfully participate not only in the discussions, but in the setting of the agenda. One important prerequisite to youth participation especially those from the global south, would be increased access to funding, which is often an unseen barrier. The youth should be given a seat at the table, not just for the sake of representation, but because we need to be part of shaping the world that we will someday inherit. With this, I ask the panel, what processes have been catalyzed to ensure that the youth are meaningfully represented and consulted in the planning of national environment and climate strategies? As the writer Arundhati Roy observed, nothing could be worse than a return to normality. As we try to address and recover from the pandemic, we do so with an eye to a transformative future. We can only imagine and create that future if we are armed with the research of scientists, the innovativeness of business, the public-mindedness of policymakers, the vibrance of citizens' movements, and, as always, the passion and idealism of the youth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julio. And look, I want to throw that right back at Jana and Graham, get your thoughts, and maybe bring Tapan in as well. How can we better engage with the youth, meaningfully represent youth, which is such a critical part of this? Jana, let me kick it off with you, but I'd be interested to get anyone's views on that.
Axel, that was Julio. Thank you so much. That really, that resonates with me so much, is what you said, and especially emphasizing the need to have the youth at the table, not just for representation, but because of the high stakes that youth really has in driving solutions and setting the strategies. So when I came to this job, which was just 3 months ago, although I've been with Geo for over a decade, one of the things that I really wanted to leverage is the various pockets of youth engagements around the world in the scene of Earth observation, Earth science, data technology. So this November, during GEO's largest sort of gathering that we call GEO Week, we will be moving towards setting up a sustained youth community of practice, GEO Youth Community of Practice. And my vision is that before too long, and I might be getting a little bit ahead of the process here, but my vision is that we will actually aim to creating a seat at the table for representatives of the youth community of practice, precisely for the reasons that Julio just mentioned. So I would say stay tuned, but also if I can get contacts perhaps to Julio, and I did take down the group that he represents, I would be absolutely thrilled to have him perhaps consider being part of setting up this brand new GEO Youth Community of Practice and providing leadership from the Asia-Pacific region as well.
Wonderful. Jana, again, thank you for moving things forward. It's such a critical part of this conversation. Graham, let's get a quick word from you, and then Tapan, I'd be interested to get your views on youth. Yeah. Go ahead, Graham.
So, yes, I agree with Jana that it was a very good intervention by Julio, so thank you for that. I think there's nothing more important than empowering young people, connecting them, harnessing their passion, and I think there are ways that can be done. For example, we've worked on one project called A Young Person's Plan for the Planet, connecting people, working to find solutions locally to the Sustainable Development Goals. These sort of projects can be scaled up and engage people around the region. So I think there are ways for doing that. Getting people involved in policy development is also important. There are mechanisms in different countries, but they do need to be strengthened. So I think, I agree, you need a place at the table. We're happy to find an ongoing dialogue with you, and we're, like Jana, be keen to get your card.
Thank you, Graham. Tapan, I hope you are still with us. Getting the youth a place at the table, getting youth involved in on the policy side. How hopeful are you?
Axel, thank you for the question. I'm really delighted to tell you that in Mongolia, we've launched a youth parliament with the Speaker of the Parliament recently, and the first topic we've taken is climate change and climate action. And we have had youth all over Mongolia from every IMUG, every province represent there and talk about not only their own views, but representing the whole youth together in having a voice on the table and that they need to be speaking loudly. Similarly, we've had many actions about building a positive Mongolia. We've had the UN Youth Advisory Panel we've been having for years together. So I fully agree that the youth is most crucial in terms of engagement, not only for now, but in building the future that we want to create, because they are the people who will carry this legacy forward, whether we have a disabled planet or a enabled planet. And that's where we need to all work together to empower the youth to have a voice and create enabling conditions to have a seat at the decision making and policy making seats. And we are trying our best here in Mongolia to be a good role model and showcase that in the best possible way. Thank you, Axel.
Thank you, Tapan. And on the back of that, a question comes through from someone in the audience, and we can throw the youth in here as well. The question is, how can we create more trust between all these moving parts? The civil society, private sector, governments, but let's throw youth in there as well. But creating that trust between these communities is clearly such a critical piece of this. How do you do that, and how do you effectively measure that?
To me, Axel?
Go ahead, Tapan. Yeah.
Okay, so I think the role of the UN resident coordinator is more like the conductor of a orchestra. We need to build all the stakeholders together, and that's what we do. So the way we are developing a strategy with the UN and the government is including all stakeholders, including youth, including private sector, including civil society, including academia, the government and the IFIs and development partners together. So when we are developing a strategy, we have done a common country analysis together with all stakeholders, presenting it to them, and then prioritizing which SDGs should be prioritized, what are the goals and targets that the government has taken, where we need to get people engaged so that they have more ownership, because engagement leads to ownership, and ownership leads to commitment. And that's where with ownership will come trust, with the commitments that we can make this world a better one. So that's what we are trying in the reformed UN processes that we are engaging in. Thank you.
Thank you, Tapan. And Sonia, I want to bring you back in. A couple of questions, actually. First, on this youth issue, getting them meaningfully represented, engaging better with youth. What is UNEP's line on this?
Well, for sure, we want youth engaged, and we are definitely looking at forums like this and the interventions like this to ensure that there will be much space for them, because we have learned that the more that we have opportunities to engage and get them, if I may also say in unscripted and plain language, is the more it has been effective for us in pushing the agendas with government and business and other stakeholders. So we definitely welcome it, and we'll be doing more in that area.
Okay, Sonia, thank you. And look, I want to stay with you and come back. I'm going to change tack again, go back to something that we were talking about with Stephen, Diane, and Harry, and that was public procurement. A question comes through from the audience, Sonia. Are governments willing to show more transparency regarding sustainable procurement and their performance in this area? It's an important question.
Yeah, it really is an important question. Across all regions, we have countries that are engaging in sustainable procurement. And about 4 or 5 years ago, UNEP issued a report on green economies that indicated that we had about 41 countries that we could showcase the work that they were doing in this area. So, UNEP is continuing its work with these governments to scale up. We have a green economy program. And through this initiative and the initiatives we're launching with the Science Business Policy Forum, it is imperative that we bring all the governments together to create the impact that we want. Now, in order to do this, data and transparency are essential for the process, and we're working on that as well. So that point about transparency is very good. And if we change the enormous funds, if we channel these funds that make up public procurement, which is about 12% of GDP, we can make immense progress in achieving the SDGs. So definitely we will be encouraging more governments to increase their transparency in this area. Thanks, Axel.
Thank you. Harry and Steve, and indeed Diane, more questions coming through on this issue of procurement. Why is the world moving so slowly? And we touched on this a little bit, but why is the world moving so slowly on sustainable procurement in general, Harry?
Well, I think it's let's say the temptation of the initial lower price tag. So we're not that good at investing in the future. But I would say there's also hope because the one investment that we are able to make that pays off long term, but it initially gives us sleepless nights and have us change diapers and do a lot of work before. Let's say that is actually when we are when we have children, and also when we are fortunate enough to have children. That is a long-term decision that also has, you could say, a sustainable view on it. And so I would say if we also look at that and then see what is really needed in procurement, medium and long term, as a driver for change, I think then there's a possibility that we speed up the implementation because the logic fits in a nutshell. New technologies are overall through their lifetime cheaper. They're better for the economy, for the city economy, household economy, national economy, but also they provide lots of benefits. Just talking about lighting, we see, apart from all the statistics on energy saving and carbon mitigation, that also connect the street lighting reduces traffic accidents at night. It reduces street crime, assaults and burglary. We see people have a more comfortable home, let's say more productive workplace. So the logic fits into a nutshell. And I would say they also have one call to our political stakeholders, and then let's speed up, then design the circular or the green performance-based procurement practices, and practice those.
Okay, Stephen, same question to you. Moving so slowly. I mean, we did touch a little bit on it, but what's the problem here?
Yeah, I mean, to build on what Harry said, and in earlier comments I made, it really is that first cost issue, right? So then I think that ties back to my earlier comments on the importance of standards, right? Look, Axel, let's face it, left to their own devices, people, businesses will make bad decisions, right? You talk about educated consumers in a highly developed country going to the shop to buy a refrigerator. It's so tempting to just grab the cheapest product, right? So by putting a standard in place, you set a baseline that no one can go below, right? So I think to get the sustainable public procurement bit right, it goes hand in hand with the standards for the products that are being purchased. So, that takes away, at least one element of the decision from the decision maker. And I was just going through my computer and I couldn't find it quickly. I apologize. But if I'm not mistaken, UNEP is just published or is on the brink of publishing a new paper on procurement with methodologies for integrating sustainability into the purchasing decisions. Perhaps someone from UNEP can comment on that. I did read the paper, and it is quite an exciting development, I would say, on an important subject. And I invite the audience to seek that paper out. Thanks.
Okay. Good, thank you, Stephen. And Diane, again, just finishing up on procurement. How is the World Business Council on Sustainable Development tackling sustainable procurement in the private sector? Is a question from the audience.
A quick build I would add, based on what has already been shared by Harry and Stephen, one of the things that we have to do is really address the practices on the ground, because procurement can influence how those practices are developing the sustainable items that companies are purchasing. So, for example, work the WBCSD is doing in partnership with UNEP Finance is to create some of the expectations and KPIs that businesses will use in purchasing materials, in this case, agricultural ingredients. Also, in that partnership with UNEP FI and others, we're creating a set of metrics for the banks and the finance communities to assess performance of these companies in agricultural value chains. That has to drive performance at the ground. That creates the need for these financial mechanisms that allow farmers, other producers, to create the transition plan for how they change their practices so that what they're growing, producing, mining is a more sustainably produced product. That can be built into procurement requirements, as I shared before, but it can also be supported through these types of financial mechanisms. And as Stephen was just saying, UNEP, particularly UNEP Finance, has been a real leader in creating some of these transitions. We've been really happy to partner with them on that kind of work.
Okay, great. Thank you very much indeed, Dan. Look, one thing we did in the first part of the session earlier this morning was end with the same question to each of you, and that is it's a broad question about ambitions and about actions that you want to see and you feel are realistic in paving the way ahead. So let me do that, and I'll start with Julio, who I know is still on from Youth Major Groups. You heard what three of our speakers, I think it was three speakers, Graham, Yana, and Tapan, had to say in response to your intervention, Julio. With that in mind, what are the ambitions that you have now? What are the ambitions, the ambitious actions that pave the way, would you say?
Yes, thank you for those responses, and we definitely appreciate these kinds of responses, especially from those who want to invite us to the table. We from the Children and Youth Major Group believe in the principle that nothing about youth is without youth. So that means that in terms of planning for a decisive and sustainable future, there needs to be some broad-based and participatory representation from the stakeholders who will eventually have to inherit it. So this means that whenever we try to plan about sustainable financing or investing in our future, there needs to be a thought process that we need to try to maximize the welfare of the stakeholders in mind. So these are the youth, these are the indigenous people, these are those who are socially excluded, and those who are definitely feeling the brunt of the climate, COVID, and economic crisis. And it is only through that reimagining can we try to really see a transformative future that we all want to try to achieve.
Okay, Julio, thank you once again for your thoughts. Tapan Mishra in Mongolia, the two or three ambitions that you have, the actions, the most realistic actions that you can see put in place to pave the way. You're on mute, Tapan. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. The youth is the key driver for the future. So we need to engage with them as well as other partners. The ambition that we have in the UN is to build a very inclusive and sustainable development model towards the 2030 agenda, leaving no one behind, keeping really not as a tagline, but in terms of our planning, in our policy coherence, in our actions, in our results that we report back later. So our major ambition is to ensure that we create an inclusive and development agenda for Mongolia, including all the stakeholders. And in the less than a decade that we have ahead, we demonstrate this is possible. The pandemic has shown us that we have to engage in new and innovative ways. And like we're doing on this leveraging technology now, we're using and building a better digital nation to leverage all the people in remote areas in Mongolia in the extreme cold of minus 40, minus 50 degrees Celsius to make a life better. And that's the ambition we have, to show that it's possible, working with the government and all other stakeholders to ensure with youth, private sector, civil society, academia, and the development partners that we create a right agenda, the common agenda that the Secretary General has talked about. Thank you.
Okay, very good, Tapan. Thank you very much indeed. Harry, what are the main messages you want our audience to go away with?
I would say implement and communicate. So we are living in a world where increasingly facts are turned into opinions and opinions are turned into facts, and this is not helping us in accelerating sustainable progress. I think it's the task of this forum through science to show the facts, through business to enable this with technologies, and through policies to really shape the implementation framework, but then to communicate and to communicate it not only about the rational benefits, but also what it means for people, what it means for youth, the jobs that it creates, and through this then to influence the voting and the buying behavior that we need as part of the acceleration.
Okay, Harry, thank you. And Stephen, to that point, I mean, the communication, is such a critical piece of this, isn't it? And we throw around these ideas, but communicating that effectively. And I said right at the start of this this session earlier, talking to each other, listening to each other, communicating effectively and efficiently among the different actors and communities involved is so critical. How good or bad do you think we are at that generally?
Yeah, I mean that is the critical bit, isn't it? Right? Look, I believe in the power of public-private partnerships. Look, the motto of my organization, it really is, any trade associations, we can do so much more together than we can do as individuals, right? So, I mentioned, United for Efficiency earlier. That brings together governments, that brings together the private sector. It brings together the companies that are actually making the energy efficient products. It's this recognition that we can do more together than we can on as individual companies. Um, you know, and to Harry's point and to earlier bits about then accelerating on action, right? So then I see the role of these partnerships as, bringing forward the message that, the technologies exist. The projects are there; they're ready to be implemented on. Let's just stop talking and get on with it, right? This is a cop of action. I think people are tired of the rhetoric. So let's just get down to business.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Stephen. Diane, same question to you. With that in mind, tired of the rhetoric. Let's get down to business. What are the actions? The two or three key things you want to see happen now?
Well, urgent action is absolutely critical. So we need to figure out ways to accelerate. So that means partnership. This ability to have an open dialogue was proven, I think, really successfully. Let me use a very recent UN example. The UN just hosted its first Food Systems Summit, which was a cross-agency partnership. It raised a lot of these challenges around what we need to do to address food system transformation on climate and nature. It created dialogues, national dialogues, in which governments, business, civil society, academia, science all came together to talk about what's the national pathways to address nature positive net zero production, to create healthy diet focus. This leadership, it had youth forums, it had private sector forums, it created really a people's movement. We're starting to see some of the outcomes from that event, which was held during the UN General Assembly, move into the way that the climate COP teams are preparing for how we bring all these voices forward and how we take that action and partnership forward. So this focus on dialogue, on how we partner together, and how we really accelerate these key transition points is absolutely going to be key.
Okay, Diane, thank you very much indeed. Same question to you, Jana, and dialogue is, you've talked about it. You've already suggested that we put new things in place, that you will put new things in place over the coming months. Clearly, that communication is critical to you as well. What else is critical to you?
Thank you, Axel. I think perhaps it's a different play on the word accelerate, but scaling. We are definitely seeing successful public-private partnerships happening here and there. How do we truly scale it so that we are covering the globe with these successes? A lot of our partners are just doing fantastic work working with a number of countries in the global south. We have partners in the private sector that are engaging with us, focusing on specific communities, on specific regions. We just need to somehow to figure out how to scale it quickly. And I do think there's just no magic wand. Indeed, this is going to really rely on systematic conversations, that after we walk away from this launch, we don't just stop, but indeed that we follow up with, that we take action on some of the indications that we've shared here that we were going to do collectively. So I think it's just committing to systematic conversations to continue to develop, to scale our success. And just more squarely from the perspective of the group on Earth observations, and I just heard Diane say, and I couldn't agree more with her, that we need to accelerate action to drive partnerships. I would add, the action must be informed by evidence, by environmental intelligence. And I would love to see the business community, the policy community to become insatiable when it comes to devouring this environmental data, because it provides objective, transparent environmental intelligence. That is what I would like to see just absolutely take off, because we have the data, we have the means to get it to these communities. We just want them to know it's there, it's useful, it's critical, and how to use it. So I'll leave it at this.
Great. Thank you very much indeed, Jana. And Graham, what's the next step in engaging people, engaging communities with scientific endeavour? What would you like to see next?
Axel, I thought you were going to give me 3 wishes, but I
I'm
the
very
theme.
happy to give you 3 wishes as well, Graham. Very happy to give you 3
Oh,
wishes. Go ahead.
Following on the young persons theme, first of all, we have to strengthen youth dialogue across borders in the Asia Pacific region. And with COVID, we've all learned to communicate at a distance, and I think we've got to take those lessons and move them forward. So I will undertake to try and work with the Asia Pacific network of science centres, and we've got members from Turkey, China, down to New Zealand, to engage better young people in dialogue around the issues of science and technology. I think also we do need investment in the development of a decadal plan for citizen science in the region, and that will drive the generation of data. It'll drive the building of capability, the sharing of technology and innovation, and of course it will allow that scaling that is so important that Jana mentioned. And then probably just 2 exemplar projects, maybe plastics in the ocean and mosquitoes, I don't know, but the 2 projects that can be rolled out across all of the countries in the region, studied intensely, properly evaluated, and then used as exemplars to help take the sector further.
Okay, Graham, thank you very much indeed. Sonia, I want to finish up with you, and I want to hear your ambitions. But first, let me start with a question from the audience, and it goes like this: in what ways can UNEP further empower the Science Policy Business Forum to create a stronger voice for the private sector during UN assemblies through its unique and very powerful sets of partnerships? So start with that one, and then maybe we'll sort of bleed that into the ambitions.
Well, Axel, and thanks very much for the question. I think this forum that we are having now and this fabulous exchange of ideas is particularly highlighting how we will be using the Science Business Forum to accelerate the voice of partnerships, business, all these stakeholders to move it forward. And we're definitely building and investing in this platform. We are learning and exchanging ideas. I heard people talking about the finance initiative. We have a RISE platform, and we have this fabulous forum here. And so I think that UNEP will be engaging to strengthen our voice or advocacy. And one of the powers that we have is we bring people together across regions for sharing knowledge. And this is something I heard panel members saying, and we can share the data because there is a lot of data, as one of the panel members said. So that's what I would say to that question from the audience. And you were asking me about ambitions.
Yeah, the 2 or 3 ambitions of yours now.
Okay, so I think, building on what's been said before, and so as not to repeat, I think I put nature at the heart of the COVID recovery, including in terms of sustainable finance and sustainable stimulus packages. I think that's really critical. The second thing is we need more of these net zero initiatives being put in government legislation frameworks. We all have to work on that. And finally, I would like us to channel investment in the right direction to leave no one behind, especially when we look at vulnerable nations and we have to bridge the gender divide. And we haven't spoken about that as much today, but that is also an element that we're looking at as we're looking at the sustainability of all our efforts and we're trying to eradicate poverty. Thanks.
Thank you, Sonia. And indeed, that is an important piece of this discussion. Look, we end it there. It really has been a fascinating morning and indeed afternoon. The afternoon segment, this segment, technology, innovation, and people. The morning, from pandemic to recovery. So the policy piece first, or more of a focus on policy, and then, of course, on more of a focus on the private sector. Some really, really good ideas on the table, some super interventions as well, in particular from the youth that we heard just now. I'd like to thank all of our speakers for their interventions. Sonia, Tapan, Harry, Stephen, Diane, Jana, and Graham. That ends this high-level opening session of the forum. It's been a real honor for me to get engaged again with this. As I said at the beginning, a real momentum has started in this forum, and it clearly continues. We are listening to each other. We are talking openly with each other with a view to effective and efficient results going forward. So thank you very much to all of you for including me in that as well. We now move to the thematic sessions of the sessions on marine litter and zoonosis. It remains for me to say thanks again to all of you, and goodbye.